Tonight our reading is from Luke chapter 20, verses 1 to 19. In our reading today, we read of Jesus being challenged in several ways, but he responds by telling them that hostility will not end well for them. So, Luke chapter 20, starting at verse 1. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. "Tell us by what authority you are doing these things," they said. "Who gave you this authority?" He replied, "I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin?" They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, 'Why didn't you believe him?' But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us because they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered, "We don't know where it was from." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one they also beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, "God forbid." Jesus looked directly at them and asked, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? 'The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed.'" The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people.
Good evening, my name's Nathan. I am the pastor at our City South congregation, and it's great to be with you this evening, even if we're hitting on a pretty rough passage of the Bible, a passage dealing with something we don't like to be confronted with, and that is judgment. The idea that God is judge, that Jesus came not just to bring God's love, but to bring judgment on the world. And so I want to ask you as we start this evening, when judgment comes for you, will you be ready? When you stand before God as your judge, will you be ready? We don't like to think of judgment like any part of modern life that we find a bit too tricky to think too hard about. We've pushed it into reality television. So judgment is for people who don't make the right connections and so don't get a rose, or people who don't play the game of life right, who aren't survivors and so get their flame snuffed out. Or there's, of course, trial by Kyle, where you can give the authority of a judge to this man, Kyle Sandilands, and have him make judgments on your life and your weird disputes, even disputes you have with your partner, your spouse. You can take those disputes onto television and you can give Kyle the authority, and his decisions are binding. He has all the authority of a judge so long as we, people, give it to him. See, really, this isn't real authority. This is reality TV authority. It's fake. It's authority vested in him just by the audience. And I wonder this evening, would you be comfortable facing a reality TV judge, having Kyle make decisions about you? Are you comfortable with the idea of facing the real judge, though? The one with real power? That's actually the question confronting Israel in tonight's passage. And for all the ways we might trivialise judgment in our culture, judgment is serious business. And God's judgment is the most serious of all. And in today's passage, we see God's judgment coming on Israel. And the question is, will they avoid his judgment? Will they avoid being found wanting, or will they get snuffed out? Is this the end of the road for them? And it's all ultimately about whether they accept the authority of Jesus as judge and king or reject him. And the same is true for us and for the judgment we might face before God, or that we will face before God. Like so much of the action in this section of Luke, this begins at the heart of Israel in the temple. The temple was the seat of Israel's fruitfulness. It was where it all begins because it's where Israel goes to meet with God. It's where they are shaped as his people by his presence, by relationship with him. When Israel was faithfully connected to God's presence through the temple, things were meant to go well for them, and not just for them, but for the whole world. They were to be a blessing to the nations. Israel's relationship with God in the temple was meant to flow out into fruitfulness for the nations, and things haven't been going well there for a while when Jesus arrives in the first century. But to set the scene, the temple was a walled building, a big building. It was secure. It was the house of God, but it was also built to echo a garden. There were trees and fruit carved into the walls. It was full of images of the garden, and particularly it was meant to echo the Garden of Eden, where God was present and walked with his people. It was the source of fruitfulness and the blessing that was meant to pour out from Israel to the nations. And Jesus goes to the temple to assess just how fruitful it is under its current leadership, and to teach Israel what God's fruitful kingdom should look like. And he gets there and he's met by these current leaders of Israel, representatives of the nation, the leaders of the temple, those who are responsible for the heartbeat of Israel, for their connection to God, for their understanding of God and his law and his character, and for setting an example of what a fruitful life following God was meant to look like. That was their job as priests and teachers and elders in the community. And these leaders of Israel, these gatekeepers of the temple, they come up to Jesus, and straight away you get a heart check and you get this sense that something's not right in Israel. Because here, as they meet God's king, Jesus, as they meet the one who at the start of Luke's gospel in the baptism of John was declared to be God's son whom he loved, and who at the transfiguration God says, "This is my son whom I love, do as he says, listen to him," they come up to him and say, "Tell us by what authority you're doing these things." And these things that Jesus is doing at this point, it's preaching the kingdom, it's proclaiming the good news. It's driving out the robbers from the temple last week, if you were here with us. Who gives Jesus authority to do these things? They are face to face with the Son of God, and they do not see it. They cannot see it. Instead, they stand in judgment on Jesus, and at this point it's clear that they have no real authority. Because as leaders of God's temple, their authority is meant to come from God. But if their authority came from God, they would recognize God's Son, Jesus, for who he is. Instead, they're like Kyle. They're only judges while people are paying them attention. And they know it. We see hints of that in the passage. But now the real judge is here. He's exposing their lack of authority, and he's exposing it in front of these people who give them their power. And they don't like that. So they put Jesus on trial. By what authority do you do these things? These mini Kyles standing in judgment of Jesus, and Jesus flips the script on them. He says, "No, I'm going to ask you a question as well. Who's the judge in this situation? Who's doing the judging? Who's figuring out who's who in the jungle here?" Jesus nails them because his question actually supports his authority. It's a reminder that he was baptized by John the Baptist, and there it was declared that he's God's son, who God loves, who's sent by God into the world. And it also undermines the authority of the Pharisees and the teachers and the elders, showing that their authority doesn't come from God, but only from the people recognizing them. Because Jesus says to them, John's baptism, that baptism that people flocked out to see in the wilderness, was it from heaven or was it of human origin? And these leaders of Israel, they know it's a trap and they know they're skewered. Because they say to each other, if we say from heaven, well, he'll say, why didn't you believe him when he baptized me, this one who came to prepare the way for my arrival? But if we say of human origin, we'll lose our standing with the people. And they know that really their power, their authority at this point comes from the people. We'll lose our position with them. They'll stone us because they're persuaded that John was a prophet. So they're trapped. So they answer, we don't know where it was from. And Jesus says, well, I'm not going to tell you. But here we see Israel's spiritual leaders face to face with God's glorious Son, coming with God's authority, coming to proclaim God's kingdom arriving in earth, the kingdom they have been waiting for from the Old Testament. And these leaders of Israel, they won't recognize John as a prophet because to do so, they would have to recognize Jesus as a king. They would have to give up their fake authority and serve him. And at this point, we see that they are so far from the face of God, from the presence of God, from the Spirit of God, from what they're actually meant to be doing as stewards of the temple and of his presence in the world. They're meant to be connecting God's people to God in order to connect the nations to God, and they can't and won't recognize God's authority embodied in Jesus. And this is because they put themselves and the people who give them their authority in the place of God. They fear people who can take their authority away rather than fearing the God whose authority they should be operating with as Israel's leaders. And so Jesus comes to judge them. He doesn't just not answer their question, he tells a parable that condemns them for their refusal to know God and their rejection of his authority. He tells this parable about a man who plants a vineyard, who rents it to some farmers and goes away for a long period of time. And at harvest time, when the workers are meant to be producing fruits, he sends a servant to take some of that fruit, to enjoy some of the fruit of this vineyard. But the tenants, as we saw in the video and as we heard read for us, they beat him and they send him away. So he sends another servant and the same thing happens, and another servant and the same thing happens. These owners of the vineyard have set them up as authorities, but they are fake authorities. They are tenants. They're meant to be under the authority of the vineyard owner, but they've set themselves up as judge, jury, and executioners. They're not just trampling the grapes of the vineyard to make wine, they're trampling on the owner of the vineyard with their disobedience, with their treason. They've set themselves up as fake authorities, and they've pit themselves against the one with real authority. And so the owner of the vineyard says to himself, in response to this treason, in response to them usurping his place, he says, what shall I do? I'll send my son whom I love. Just notice that language. It's the same as at the baptism and the transfiguration of Jesus. I'll send my son whom I love. Perhaps they'll respect him. And of course they don't. When the tenants see the son, they talk the matter over together. They get together in a little rebellion, little group. They say, this is the heir. Let's kill him and the inheritance will be ours. We'll take the vineyard by force. They don't want to lose the patch they've temporarily got as caretakers. They want to take it for themselves. They want to push the vineyard owner from the picture, and to do that by killing the son. And they don't see that in order to become heirs and share in the inheritance, they're actually meant to become part of the family of the owner, not his enemies. And so they kill the son. They turf him outside the vineyard. And Jesus asks what's surely a rhetorical question to those listening on, the crowd of people and the leaders of Israel. What will the owner do when the stewards of the vineyard are unfaithful? What will he do when the leaders of his temple turn the people's hearts from him and turn the temple into a den of robbers? What will he do when the leaders of Israel put his son to death? Because that's what's really going on here. Jesus is talking about the leaders of Israel and the temple and God's chosen king and their rejection of him. Well, he says the owner of the vineyard will come in judgment. He'll kill those tenants, those people who he appointed to steward the vineyard, to share its fruit with him. And he'll give the vineyard to others. He'll give the kingdom, this picture of God's kingdom, he'll give the temple, he'll give the presence of God, he'll take it and he'll give it to the Gentiles, he'll give it to the nations. The leaders of Israel have done such a poor job bringing the presence of God into the world and blessing their neighbours that it will be taken from them. And so Jesus then mixes his garden and building metaphors. He's still really talking about the temple, about this building project, and he condemns those, the leaders of the temple, for not getting the building project right. He quotes Psalm 118, which is the same psalm we saw quoted last week as he arrived in the city, where the crowd of people following him were crying out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." That same psalm has this picture of the temple building project with this stone that the builders have rejected becoming the cornerstone, the basis of something new that happens when God's kingdom comes, a new temple where God will be present with his people. Jesus looks at the leaders of Israel, people who know these scriptures backwards, and he says, what's the meaning of that which is written, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? Well, he says this is all about God's king coming. This is being fulfilled in my arrival, but it's also, he says, it's also a message of judgment. See, those who reject the king, those who reject this stone, everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. This isn't just a good news story about a new temple, about salvation. It's a proclamation of judgment. Jesus is coming to fulfill this promise that God will send a king as saviour and judge who comes into the world with his authority, who comes to destroy false temples and rebuild God's house, who comes as the cornerstone of that building project, the foundation on which it will be built. Now, sometimes when Jesus teaches in parables, they're confusing and nobody really knows what's going on. But the meaning of this parable, despite its mixed metaphors with buildings and gardens and vineyards, it's exceptionally clear to the people listening on. It's clear that Jesus is pronouncing judgment on the elders, the teachers, and the Pharisees. See, the vineyard, this picture that he uses, it's a picture rich with meaning for his audience. The Old Testament has the temple set up visually as a fruitful walled garden, something like a vineyard, but Israel too is often described as being a vineyard or a vine. So Psalm 80 picks up this common metaphor. It describes God planting Israel like a vine, pulling them out of Egypt in the Exodus, setting them up as his people, planting them as a vine in a cleared patch of ground that it then fills. So a patch of ground filled with grapevines, that's a vineyard. Israel is meant to be this fruitful presence in the world, planted by God. And here Jesus picks up that imagery to say these leaders aren't doing it properly. They're meant to be guiding Israel to fruitfulness, to connection with him as the planter of the vineyard, and in fact they're pulling them away, pulling them towards destruction. And the leaders know it's about them. This isn't in code. Luke tells us they know it's about them. It's a warning for them, a call to turn from judgment because the Old Testament scriptures are being fulfilled. The king is coming home. And he's coming with God's authority, and those who set themselves up against it, these rebels who are not recognizing God's authority, well, they're facing judgment, but they're not scared of God. They're scared of the people. They're scared of the people. We're told that they start looking for a way to kill Jesus, to arrest him immediately because he's spoken against them, but they are afraid, not of God, not of judgment, but of the people. The people who give them their power. These self-appointed judges who only have power so long as the people give it to them are worried because Jesus has called them out. He's revealed how hollow their authority is. because he has come with real authority, God's authority. He has put them on trial. Now, of course, these are the leaders of Israel who ultimately put Jesus on trial and have him executed by the Romans. This is the story of the owner of the vineyard, the God of the temple, the God of Israel, the creator of the world, sending his beloved Son into the world. And the people, the very people who are meant to be the builders of his house, the people who are meant to welcome him with open arms, the people who are meant to share in his fruitfulness, to share in the task of his kingdom, the good news he's proclaiming, his fruitful vineyard, the leaders of the people do not respect him. They reject him. They put him to death. They deny that his authority comes from God. They try to steal his inheritance. They try to wall off the kingdom. They judge Jesus and they find him wanting. And this is what we do too when we reject Jesus as King of Israel, of the world, and of you and me. But in this moment where Jesus is judged by the world and rejected, Israel, the world, and those of us who would put Jesus on the cross bring judgment on ourselves. Because this is the moment where the owner sends his Son into the world and the Son is rejected. This is what Jesus is warning us about in that story, in that parable. So Israel was meant to bring fruit for the nations through its king, through this kingdom, through God's presence spreading through the nations from the temple. But here in this moment, as the true temple is nailed to a tree, Israel's leaders reveal themselves as false, as fake authorities, nailing the true Israel, the true temple, the true cornerstone chosen by God to the cross to be executed. In this moment, the vine, the true vine, God's vine, true Israel, is cut down. See, Jesus in this moment is the true child of God. He is the true Israel, and fake Israel has just stood in judgment over him, destroyed him. In the Psalm, in Psalm 80, there's this picture of the vine being cut down and burned with fire, and as that happens, God working in judgment, rebuking his people and then perishing. But even as this happens, even as true Israel is destroyed, there is hope. There is salvation. God doesn't just come into the picture in Jesus with judgment, but also with salvation. In the Psalm, there's this picture of a man resting at God's right hand, the Son of Man he has raised up for himself, true Israel, a true vine. In this destruction and judgment, there is hope of resurrection, hope of return from exile, hope of a fruitful vineyard again, because the Son of Man will bring an Israel, a faithful Israel, a new vine back to God. People who won't turn away from God, who have been revived so they might call on God's name. People who are restored and who God shines his face on, that they might be saved. See, this psalm is a psalm of hope through judgment. As true Israel, the Son of Man stands up, is raised up, and brings people with him into fruitfulness. See, in the cross, Jesus judges the Israel that rejects him. Jesus, the true Israel, the cornerstone, becomes the Son of Man, or is the Son of Man, who invites us to be these people. Invites us, the people from the nations, the outsiders, the Gentiles, to receive his kingdom. That's judgment on Israel, but it's good news for us. Through Jesus, that true Israel, that cornerstone, we are grafted into the vine. We are invited to be part of the King's building project in the world. God's fruitful presence, a fruitful building, this new temple built on the cornerstone that Israel's leaders rejected, but that God chose. To be part of a new kingdom built on the authority of God's right-hand man, this King, Jesus. We're invited in, we're included, we're grafted into this vineyard, not just as hired workers, not just as tenants, but in Jesus by the Spirit as children of God, heirs of the kingdom, sharing in its inheritance, sharing in its fruit as we share the fruit of God's kingdom in the world. So what are we meant to do with this story of these leaders of Israel rejecting their king? We've got to realise that we're not straight away Israel's leaders. They had a particular job to do to welcome God's king into the world as the people who are meant to be looking after the kingdom, and we are the outsiders the kingdom is given to. And yet we should learn from their example, because God comes into the world in Jesus as judge, and everybody who rejects him as the cornerstone faces judgment, not just Israel's leaders. The tenants, they reject the owner's son because they want to keep what they have for themselves. They were trying to steal inheritance. They were trying to do their own building project apart from the cornerstone. They were worshipping something else other than God. They'd put their power and position and authority in the place that God is meant to occupy for them, and that has become more important to them than the one who gives them the vineyard to look after. They love themselves, they love their position, and so they fear the people who might take that away from them. When instead they should love and fear God, because they should have been connecting Israel and the nations to God's presence. They should have been acting with God's authority in the world, spreading his fruitful pattern of life to the world. They should have been recognizing Jesus when he arrived as the source. They should have been recognizing, the source of his authority. But instead they rejected him and tried to kill him. Don't be like them. These leaders of Israel are serving themselves and the people as their gods rather than God, because these people have become bigger in their world than God. They've made humanity big and God small. They can't possibly bring God's fruitful presence into the world when they have no experience of God's presence and his authority in their lives. Ed Welsh, in this helpful book where the title does a lot of the work, When People Are Big and God is Small, he says fear, when the Bible talks about it, well, it includes the way we might talk about fear when we're scared of something, but it also extends to holding someone in awe, being controlled or mastered by people, worshipping other people, putting your trust in people or needing people, which is the situation these leaders of Israel found themselves in. They were afraid of the people because all of their security and their status and their power came from being recognised by the people, not by God. These leaders of Israel should have found their position in the world and their authority and their security by seeking God's face. And so if they'd been doing that, they would have recognised Jesus as king when they came face to face with him. So who is it that you fear? Who is it in your life that is stopping you recognising Jesus as your king? Or who is leading you to reject Jesus as your king in different moments? Who do you fear? Do you fear God, the judge of all the earth? Don't fear people. People who might affect the security that you're enjoying or pursuing, the building project that you're investing yourself into with your life, the work that you're doing, the status that you're seeking, the power you want to wield. Fear God and seek security in his kingdom. The kingdom that Jesus came to proclaim and to bring through his death and resurrection. Jesus' authority is the authority that matters. Fearing people will often lead to us rejecting Jesus, not just as king, but as the cornerstone, as the foundation of our life. If we fear a loss of power or status or wealth or security, or those things we might want to build our temples on, the things we worship, all the authority we seek to hold or to follow in this world, if we fear a loss of those things, it will lead us to reject Jesus as our king. And to reject Jesus as our king is not just to put him to one side, it's to declare war on him. It's to join in his crucifixion, his rejection. He becomes one we stand in judgment over rather than the one who stands in judgment over us. To reject him as king is not just to reject following him, but it's to reject God's place in the world. It's to declare war on God. and that brings judgment. And no matter how big you think those people in your life are, the ones you fear, the ones you think your security depends upon, God is bigger than those people. God's authority is realer than those people's. God is your judge. Jesus is your king if you have put your faith in him. If you have been joined in his building project in the world, if you have accepted his call to enjoy the fruits of his kingdom, he is your king. He is a bigger deal than those you fear. See, the alternative to fearing people and so rejecting Jesus as king is to build your life on the foundation that he brings. Build your life on God's cornerstone, his living stone, Jesus, to be his new temple in the world. The temple, remember, is the picture of fruitful life, of God's presence in the world. It's a picture of Eden. It's a place where people see the life and love of God at work as we submit our lives to Jesus as our King. And now, through Jesus, through the pouring out of the Spirit, through his death and resurrection and his fulfillment of those Old Testament promises about him creating a new people in himself, God's presence in the world is in us. God's temple is his people. God is dwelling in us by his Spirit as we put our trust in King Jesus and build our lives on his authority. We are the presence of God in the world. We are connected with the source of fruitful life and called to help others experience that fruitfulness as we follow our King. Peter, one of Jesus' followers, puts it this way in a letter he writes to the church, and it's in the New Testament, in 1 Peter. He says, as we come to him, to Jesus, the living stone, he's kind of quoting that Psalm 118 and reflecting on Jesus' words here in the parable. As you come to this living stone, this cornerstone, rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, as you come to him, we are to become like living stones. We are to be caught up in this building project, this new temple that is being built in the world. We are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. The very thing those leaders of Israel were meant to be doing in Israel, that they are judged for not doing, is what we are called to do as God's people. What we are equipped to do by his Spirit as he transforms us into his image. To follow Jesus as King is to become fruitful again, not fearing people, but loved by God and following Jesus as our King, submitting our lives to his rule and building our lives with him as our foundation. Taking up this task of sharing his presence in the world, and we can't do that if we are disconnected from his presence in our lives. We cannot share God's presence with others if we are not first experiencing his presence. It's exactly what the leaders of Israel were trying to do. So disconnected from God, they couldn't recognize Jesus as God's king. They wouldn't recognize his authority. We cannot hope to succeed where they failed if we do not cultivate our relationship with God and a sense of his presence in our life. The presence that is there by the Spirit when we put our faith and trust in Jesus and so are transformed as new creations. As people who in Jesus God's face shines upon. As people who are saved by grace through faith so that we might cultivate this new way of life in the world. That we might be people of his kingdom. That word cultivate, it's a gardening word. It's about fruitfulness and it's about the patient day-by-day effort it takes to keep gardens fruitful and healthy, to keep the weeds away. God being present in your life is something the Bible, from the beginning of its story in Eden through the temple to this, uses garden imagery for. This idea of fruitfulness working from health. We're to cultivate a sense of God's presence in our life. We're to be spiritual gardeners who work to see this as our reality. See, our face-to-face reality, the way we experience the world as people, our physical lives are often dominated by people rather than God. So it's really easy to fear people because we give their voice heaps more weight than we should. Because we see them face-to-face daily, and often we have a greater sense of their presence in our life than God's presence in our life. And so we need to be people who cultivate a sense that God is bigger in our life than those people are. See, life without God in the picture is ultimately like reality TV. It leaves us with a fake view of the world, with fake authorities, and leaves us fearing and worshipping fake gods, putting people in the place of God. Instead, we need to cultivate a sense of God's bigness in our lives. And so maybe the voices of people are more present in your life than the voice of God. Maybe you spend more time talking to your peers or your colleagues, not even your Christian peers and colleagues, about decisions, about what you're thinking about life in the world, and not enough with God or with those who share in His Spirit. Maybe you're so busy being bombarded with messages and opinions and voices online about what's good and what's bad that you haven't sat still and sensed God's presence in the world and His presence in your life, and remembered His authority over all things, including your life. That idea in the Psalms of being still and knowing that God is God. These are the steps that we take to be bombarded with these voices that lead us to reject Jesus as King. And so, to cultivate that sense of God's presence, we need to step in the other direction. Pray. Open God's Word. Spend time in fellowship with God's people. Spend time in silence, contemplating God and His kingdom, being equipped for this task of being His priest, this new temple in the world. Being equipped to bring God's presence into the world because He is so present in our lives that we can't help it. Cultivating a sense that our real reality is this face-to-face relationship with God secured in Jesus. The sense that in Jesus we are seated in the heavenly realm, that we have been raised with Him, that we are now God's restored people in the world, that He lives in us by His Spirit, that He is the authority over our lives, our King. See, if we don't have this sense in every moment, if we don't have this sense that God is our Father and we are His children and we can come to Him like a child comes to their Father, then we have no hope of carrying His presence into the world. Will you join me as I pray? Father, it can be pretty terrifying to be confronted with the reality of judgment, with this picture that you are a holy and incredible God, a God who is to be glorified, a God whose authority is real, and a God who, when that authority is rejected, destroys those who would stand in opposition to you. But Lord, we are so thankful that Jesus took that judgment on our behalf, that He was destroyed, that in this moment when the world was rejecting Him, you poured out your wrath on Him as well. So that as He was raised as your chosen King, He might bring many sons and daughters to glory. So that as He was raised, this new temple was built in the world, this new way of you being present in the world, a way not tied to Israel and its temple, but thrown open to all those who would put their trust in you. And we thank you that as we do this, we receive your Spirit, that you dwell in us and you make us these living stones who are part of this temple, this project that you have in the world to reveal yourself. And so we pray we would so deeply be rooted in this vine that you have planted as people who have been grafted in, that we produce fruit. A fruit that others see so that they might taste and see that you are good. We pray these things in Jesus' name.